Alrighty. So, as Los Angeles Public Library docents, despite our differences in backgrounds, what brings us together as a community is our shared fascination with the history of Central Library and our eagerness to always learn more about its architecture, its art, and the people who were responsible for creating this iconic building. Even now at 100 years old, there always seems to be something new to discover. For many of us, our quest to go deeper has taken us to this book, The Los Angeles Central Library, Building an Architectural Icon, 1872 to 1926. It's an outstanding and in-depth exploration of those dramatic years. You may have checked it out of the library. There's 26 copies of it in the catalog. You might have checked it out yourself, or you might have even bought a copy of it yourself just because it's such a reliable resource and it's something you always go back to. And we're very pleased today and excited to have as our keynote speaker its author, Professor Kenneth Breisch. Professor Breisch is a celebrated architectural author and historian. He is Associate Professor Emeritus of Architecture at the University of Southern California and the founder and past director of USC's Graduate Program in Heritage Conservation. He is also past president of the Society of Architectural Historians, a board member emeritus of Santa Monica Conservancy, and a member of the board of Santa Monica Public Library from 2001 to 2014. He has also just finished a book on the Los Angeles Library branch, or the branch libraries of the Los Angeles Library System. Today's presentation from Professor Breisch is entitled The Struggle to Do the Perfect Thing, Bertram, Goodhue, Lawrie, and the Invention of the Los Angeles Public Library. And with that, I will pass the podium over to our guest, Professor Breisch.
Let's see. Uh-oh. Oh, it's working. Good for technology. Well, it's a real honor to be here. And I love what all of you are doing for the Central Library. Before I start, though, I've spent a good deal of time, many years, looking at branch libraries, and I just want to give a shout out to them because that's really what so much about what this system is about. And you know, in traveling around the city and talking to the wonderful branch librarians, but also to others, you know, what people really think about is their library, is their branch. You know, it's where they bring their kids for story hour, use computers, etc. So it's another dimension that often is forgotten. In any case, I'd like to thank Tom McQuaid and Karen Buck for inviting me and helping me focus what I was going to talk about. Of course, have to thank the LA librarians and staff who, over many years, have helped me work my way through the archives. Christina Rice is here, and she knows how much time I've spent looking at the Tessa Kelso archives, which are truly wonderful. And John Szabo, of course, has been really supportive of all the work that I've done over time. In any case, what I'm going to talk about today, probably many of you are very familiar with. There isn't a lot new being discovered except for Oshkosh, Wisconsin, which I need to know more about, I guess. But what I thought I would do today in the short time I have is talk about architecture as a collaboration. And I think that's sometimes not really forgotten, but not focused on in the way that it might very well be. Bertram Goodhue, of course, is always celebrated as the author of the building, and we certainly know that Lawrie produced the great sculpture on the building. And those are the two individuals who I'll focus on today. But there was, a close cooperation of many people that came together to make this building possible. What Bertram Goodhue liked to call his quadrivirate. I think I pronounced that correctly, an odd word. But of course, as you know, he worked closely with Lawrie, who I'll come back to, Hartley Burr Alexander from the University of Nebraska, who, with a PhD actually from Columbia, who Goodhue met when he was working on the Nebraska State Capitol. He was kind of, I think, thrown at Goodhue, but they managed to collaborate quite well. Julian Garnsey, of course, who did the murals and the wonderful rotunda area. And then also Carlton Watkins Jr., who I think often gets kind of left behind. But it's very important to remember that Watkins had worked with Goodhue in New York and then came out to California to work on the Panama, California Exposition in San Diego in 1915. Goodhue died just after his designs for the library were accepted by the library board. And so Watkins, everything fell on Watkins' shoulders. And so I think he deserves a lot of credit for carrying out Goodhue's ideas, but for coordinating the work between Alexander Garnsey and, of course, Everett Perry, who had a very strong hand in what was going on. If you look at the correspondence, and unfortunately, as you all know, because of the fire, much of the original correspondence between Perry and all of his collaborators has been lost. But you're able to really reconstruct some of what was going on by looking at what survives in other collections. The Goodhue papers at Columbia University, Lee Lawrie's extensive archive at the Library of Congress, including multiple overlapping manuscripts for his autobiography, which was never published, called Boy Wanted, which goes back to when he was 14 years old and saw an advertisement in a Chicago newspaper looking for an apprentice sculptor. And that really began his career, which I'll come back to in a little bit more detail. And of course, the Watkins papers at UC Santa Barbara, and Hartley Burr Alexander's papers, as well as a lot of information on the library, including many photographs that don't exist elsewhere at the Ella Strong Dennison Library at Scripps. They ended up at Scripps because Alexander moved here to work on this library, and then he was commissioned to actually develop the original curriculum for what was the girls' school, or I should say college, at Scripps College. And he then went to Scripps and taught there until 1939. And so all of his work on the curriculum, but also much of his correspondence that survives from the public library is there. So all of this is of course, very important to understanding the story of the library, which I'll talk about very briefly in terms of maybe the process and, as I say, the collaboration. In addition to, of course, Mr. Goodhue, who you can see on the left, who died actually just a week after the designs were accepted for the library. We also have Lee Lawrie, a great sculptor who wrote actually a great deal about his work with Goodhue, which I think is very important. There's this draft manuscript of his autobiography, seems to have disappeared. Okay, well, I'll read what I have anyway. He wrote, among other things, and it's a draft, he writes, "The greatest honor that could be mine is that of having been the sculptor for every building of Bertram Goodhue's except one. During the long period of which this work was done, an understanding of his point of view that developed gradually allowed me at times to see into his vision and to make the thing that he saw, just as members of a family may know one another's thoughts almost before words are spoken. So I came to comprehend his meaning with very slight explanation after a while. A word, a line or two hastily drawn gave me the clue of what was in his mind. Great quantities of work took shape with little effort. Whenever a problem for sculpture came up, he would unconsciously almost design it for me in his suggestion. When it was finished and he had approved it, he would say, "Do you know, it's exactly the thing that I had in mind." So it's hard to overstate sort of that collaboration over a period of more than 3 decades. And I think when we think about Lawrie, we have to think about him working closely with Goodhue. There are accounts of Goodhue bringing drawings to Lawrie's, which I'll come back to his studio, and asking Lawrie to fill in the sculptural forms, the iconography. And then Lawrie would go back to Goodhue's office and they discuss what was going on. So I think there was more than just a sculptor-architect collaboration, which of course is evident in the way that the sculpture really grows directly out of the building itself. Lawrie himself, as I say, saw an ad asking for an apprentice for an architect, which was entitled Boy Wanted. He went to work in Chicago. He actually worked at the Columbian Exposition, which is kind of interesting because there was the Chicago World's Fair of 1893, and all of the sculpture there was plaster sculpture for the most part, a kind of weatherproof plaster called staff, which at least survived through the summer for the Columbian Exposition. But the way Lawrie would continue to work through his career was developing plaster maquettes, which he did for the library here, which I think most of you know. In 1/3 scale, those plaster maquettes were shipped out here, and then the sculptors would use those to actually produce the actual sculpture here. Goodhue was never trained specifically as an architect. It was before licensing that he got started, official licensing of the architectural profession, but he was very interested as a young man and then into his 20s in the arts and crafts movement, in the work in particular of William Morris, but also John Ruskin. And while this is not an arts and crafts building per se, it's very much a kind of late product of the ideas of Morris that the arts were unified in terms of daily life that, as you know, with arts and crafts, which really had a great history in Southern California, as in the work of Green and Green, they designed everything from the furniture to the tapestries to the rugs to the architecture itself. And so Goodhue was really carrying on that kind of tradition. Goodhue and Lawrie first met, it seems, in an early commission that Goodhue worked on even before he was working with Cram, Goodhue, and Ferguson. Although this church in Dorchester, Massachusetts, is usually attributed to all of them. He became a full partner in 1895, but apparently Lawrie saw this church and became very interested in their work. And here's my, of course, this is like Oshkosh, I guess, my missing slide. This is the manuscript in Washington, one of many versions, which are really fun to go through if you have enough time to go through all of them. In any case, I jumped ahead a little bit, but I talked about the fact that Goodhue would bring his drawings for the library to Lawrie's office and ask Lawrie to actually fill in the details. And I don't have a pointer, but you can see where the sculpture is there, and that it's left just sort of generically as figures that Lawrie would then fill in. This is one of the many drawings in the archives here, and thanks to the Getty Research Institute, we have very high resolution versions of these, which I'm very happy to say will remain as a record here, even as the drawings themselves, as paper will, might deteriorate a little bit over time. But this gives you a real close view of what is actually a drawing that's about 6 or 6.5 feet in length. But you can see that Goodhue left a lot of the detail to Lawrie. They began to collaborate actually very soon after Lawrie had seen the church. The first sculpture by Lawrie to appear in a Cramp Goodhue Ferguson building was at the Deborah Cook Sales Public Library. I think it's interesting because it's a library, and he developed, along with Goodhue, iconographic program that really prefigures what goes on in Nebraska. And here we have scenes from their bas-relief sculptures of scenes from Shakespeare and German mythology that in this particular case, Lawrie inserted into the architecture something that he would, and Goodhue, he would develop further in terms of creating sculpture that grew organically from the building, as opposed to what at the time was the traditional role of sculptors in terms of what Lawrie rather disparagingly called decorating a building. He felt that the sculptor and the painters, Goodhue the same way, should be involved from the very beginning. As Lawrie noted in his autobiography, he worked on every building except for Ashmont with Goodhue, initially, as with the Sales Library, on work by Cram, Goodhue, and Ferguson, dozens of Gothic revival, but also other medieval revival churches all across the United States. They did designs for a Los Angeles cathedral, in fact, at one particular point that was never built here. St. Thomas Episcopal Church, probably one of the most prominent of their churches on Fifth Avenue in New York. Goodhue, working actually with the company of Edward Ardolino, whose sculptors would come here eventually to produce the sculpture at the LA Public Library, produced more than 30 sculptures for this church, very much in the Gothic revival style, sort of moving back and forth between French and German Gothic medieval sculpture. Lawrie actually was born in Germany and moved to Chicago as a young man, so he probably didn't have a lot of specific memory of that, but here you can see the kind of typical sculptural decoration that you would find before Lawrie and Goodhue really developed what what Lawrie would call structural sculpture, as opposed to what we see here. This first begins to appear actually shortly after Goodhue parted ways with Ralph Adams Cram at the Church of St. Vincent Ferrer. The firm broke up around 1914. They still collaborated occasionally, but it wasn't a very pleasant, I think, divorce. But Lawrie and Goodhue continued to work together here. You can see one of the early works by them, the Church of St. Vincent Ferrer in New York City. And you can see the sculpture now beginning to emerge from the architecture. Lawrie says that Goodhue got this idea early on, probably working with the ideas of Lawrie, who says that after a great many preliminary sketches, they had arrived at a new kind of architectural sculpture that is essentially a part of the building rather than something ornate or applied, as they say, what Lawrie called structural sculpture. Forms that portray animate life emerge from blocks of stone and terminate in a historic expression. It's not sculpture, he says, but a branch grafted onto the architectural trunk. And of course, you're all familiar with what evolved here. That really began to come to fruition on a large scale at the Nebraska State Capitol. Here you see sculptures by Lee Lawrie, and you can see the kinship, of course, with the St. Vincent Ferrer sculpture. This was an elaborate architectural program for the capital, the new capital, state capital of Nebraska. Goodhue won the competition for this, actually competing with every other major firm in the country, including, I think, Cram and Ferguson, but certainly McKim, and White, and others. It was, in a sense, I think, in a way like the Bilbao Museum of the early 20th century. It was celebrated with great acclaim and really transformed the form of state capitals, which typically had looked like the Capitol in Washington, D.C. or Sacramento. Here now, though, with the dome raised on this commercial building kind of shaft that Goodhue thought reflected the new function, the extended sort of bureaucratic function of state libraries. But if you visit Lincoln, it's really quite amazing because there's the university on one side of the city, but this dominates the skyline in the city, and it's a spectacular building that began to be constructed in 1922. And I don't think I need to do a lot of explanation, but you can see where the ideas, to some extent, for the LA Public Library were coming from. And you can see the way the sculpture emerges from the architecture itself. And also the fact that Lawrie and Goodhue were trying to develop a new style of architecture that could both be read iconographically or read symbolically, but that reflected a modern era, something actually that his former partner Cram really hated. And in fact writes about it sort of in an abstruse kind of way. Cram, you might know or keep in mind, designed the library at the University of Southern California, just across town, and less than a decade after this building was designed by Goodhue. And I don't have time, but I could go into how it was his answer to Goodhue's kind of modernism. If you know the USC library, it's very much in a Romanesque revival style, which Cram continued to work on. I was going to put that in, but no, not enough time. In any case, the Nebraska State Capitol, as Lawrie says in his autobiography, has no relation to any style unless it is the child of all of them. But from the viewpoint of one who had worked for Goodhue so long in the Gothic, it is not difficult to see that it could not have happened at all without the Gothic experience. And I think that that, of course, is self-evident in terms of the importance of the sculptural program, which reads like a modern day or a 20th century Gothic cathedral in a lot of ways. But here are just a couple of other views of the Nebraska State Capitol. Now, what's interesting is that although Goodhue had won the competition and it was widely publicized, the building actually wasn't completed until 1932, as you can see here. So it actually was a hole in the ground at most when the board or the commission in LA was looking for an architect. And they turned to Goodhue, not, I think, because of the Nebraska State Capitol, although I'll put that into parentheses because he was an East Coast architect, which annoyed all of the local architects that he was chosen, sort of the opposite of Gary not being chosen for some of his early commissions, but eventually Disney Hall, of course. But what really inspired the LA board was the Panama, California Exposition, which I think a lot of you know. This appeared in 1915. Bertram Goodhue was the architect of record, in a sense, overseeing all of the work, working closely with Carlton Winslow, should be Jr. His father was an architect as well. And that brought Winslow actually out to Los Angeles, where he developed his own architectural practice, eventually working with Goodhue on the LA Public Library and then on the LA Public Library. But this was the antithesis in a lot of ways of what we ended up with here in California. According to Charles Harris Whitaker, who also worked in New York with Goodhue, he wrote in the dedication booklet, Goodhue knew from the beginning that the final design for this library would not be in Mexican Spanish. He knew that the design of a group of buildings to celebrate a festal occasion like the exposition, was a quite different matter from the design of a library, in which wholly different factors were involved. And when, while he no doubt felt that something in the nature of San Diego would be wanted, he likewise knew that it would not be his solution of the library. Goodhue was chosen not only because the board and actually most of Southern California were totally blown away by the exposition in San Diego, but he had also been one of the authors, mainly drawing the plans for the beautiful volume on the Spanish colonial architecture that was published in 1901. You can see his name there and the kind of illustrations that would have been available to the Board of Commissioners. And by this date, too, it's just important to remember that this Spanish colonial revival, or Churrigueresque, the very ornate Baroque kind of Spanish colonial revival, had taken Southern California by storm and really became the new regional idiom in Southern California here. You're probably familiar with St. Vincent de Paul Church down by USC by Albert Martin, whose name will come up again. You might remember that. 1923-25, reinforced concrete construction. Actually, Estelle Doheny had commissioned this building. She obviously knew the San Diego Exposition, but also knew several churches in Mexico that she wanted to be the model for this church, which is actually almost a copy of the San Diego Fair. In any case, if you look at the surviving drawings, Goodhue went through many versions. The Arts Commission didn't like a lot of them. The board wasn't really happy. All of the early versions in sort of a kind of Spanish, Italian, or Mediterranean Baroque style, really Spanish colonial revival. This is an early publication that you can see here that appeared in the LA Examiner. Here, two of the variations on drawings for the Hope Street elevation from June 23 and October 23. The final design would be accepted in April, so he's still working with this very ornate kind of style, which hadn't satisfied anybody for the most part, except that this is what he had been hired to do. Although by this time he was working on the designs in Nebraska, and took really, I don't want to say a right turn, I'll say a left turn, with the submission of this painting at the last minute. Really, you can see in late January or February, it's not really absolutely clear. This is, I think, still up in one of the offices here. You have it in your exhibition, Christina? Good. Excellent, excellent. I spotted it there when I was doing research in the archives, and everybody thought that this was a painting that was done after the fact of the library, but in fact, you know, there's archival evidence that Goodhue had commissioned this. And actually, I think the painter was named James Perry Wilson, who was trained actually as a painter at Columbia and worked in Goodhue's office and did a lot of renderings for them. So I'm almost sure that he probably painted this. He went on to do all of the dioramas at the Natural History Museum in New York. So he was quite accomplished. But this wowed everybody, I guess, and was a complete turn. He wrote actually to Marie Whittlesley, who was the wife of Austin Whittlesley, who had worked with Goodhue in New York and recently moved to LA as well. That he hoped that they both would like the library as it is in the form it has come to, though your husband will be shocked at the difference between it and the way the rough design stood when he left. For myself, it's a vastly and more dignified thing. And then he adds, the more dignity that can be ejected into Los Angeles, the better. He actually built a home in Montecito, but he had, let's say, legal and difficult problems with the legislature in Nebraska, and he had come to really despise Midwesterners. And of course, LA was the home of many displaced immigrant Midwesterners. In March, just before this was accepted, he wrote also to William Letheby, an older architect in England that Goodhue just greatly admired. He was a late follower in a way of William Morris. And this is just a month before he died. I shall be 55, and for almost 35 of those years, I've been working at architecture, doing all sorts and kinds of dreadful things, classic, Gothic, good knows what, and I still do. However, even my Gothic is no longer anything like historically correct, and my classic is anything but book classic. At Los Angeles, I have a public library in the same strange style or lack of style I've been telling you about. And he was corresponding often with Letheby at this particular time. But according, again, to Charles Whitaker, who part of the title for my talk comes from, Goodhue, he said, was seeking architectural simplicity, buildings expressed in terms of mass and proportion, with nothing unnecessary or meaningless, with everything essential and no more. At the same time, he felt the buildings had to impart their meaning to the public. And for this, he turned to Hartley Burr Alexander, but also, of course, then to Lee Lawrie to visualize the ideas of Alexander, who developed the whole iconographic program for the building. You all know the actual sort of, in a way, theme for the building from Lucretius, from his essay on De Reum Natura in English. And like a runner, they pass on the torch of life. And of course, you have great authors from the East on one side and great authors from the West on the other side. Something I'll conclude with in a way, but to me, it seems to me that what Goodhue was thinking as he traveled from New York through Nebraska across the country to LA, he was thinking of this passage of intellectual knowledge from Asia through Europe to New York and across the country, like Manifest Destiny maybe, as concluding really in Los Angeles on the Pacific Rim. And I think you could see the horseman here with the torch from the Parthenon, actually. And of course, Alexander developed a whole sort of epigraphic program for the library, which fits into this idea that nothing was unnecessary, and that Goodhue was striving for simplicity. Here, an inscription on basically the north side of the building, where the inscription itself takes the place of classical ornament, where you would have the, cornice, classical cornice. This culminates the piers at the base and replaces that idea with meaning as opposed to just classical ornament. As Alexander later wrote, Goodhue, or Mr. Goodhue, deliberately employed inscription in lieu of other cornice ornament, effectively to break the monotonous planes or to give texture to surfaces. Nothing was supposed to be decorative in the usual meaning of the word. And of course, as you all probably know as well, all of the inscriptions of the library are in Cheltenham font, a print font that was really invented by Bertram Goodhue in the late 1890s, working with the founder of the Cheltenham Press, Hannibal Kimball. It was used so widely, actually, that it became just known as Chelty, and it began to appear as the font of choice for the headlines in the New York Times in 1906. And there's still versions of Cheltenham that are used in the New York Times to this day. But this was very much in the tradition of William Morris and the arts and crafts movement. Some of you may know the Kelmscott, or the Kelmscott Chaucer that Morris produced. Lawrie, of course, commemorated both Morris and Goodhue in the south entry. Goodhue at the far right, just to his left is William Morris with his printing press. A kind of range, again, in a way, thematically from Gutenberg on the far left to Goodhue on the right. So this really became the basis for this kind of collaboration. Here, just another detail, you can see the kind of generic figures at the on the south facade. Lawrie was entrusted by Goodhue after working some 3 decades together to develop these sculptures, which he produced, as I mentioned earlier, in 1/3 scale. These are plaster maquettes, plaster models that were then shipped out here and used by Edward Ardolino, and a master sculptor in New York, and or stone cutter, actually, and his crew who came out here to produce the sculpture that we have now. Here, you can see two of the sculptures which are completed, and some of you may have figured this out, but it dawned on me just yesterday that those two little white specks are the plaster maquettes that Ardolino would be using, or his stone cutters. They're 1/3 the scale and next to where the sculpture's about to be produced. The sculpture itself was produced in situ or sculpted in situ or in place. Very unusual for this time because sculpture was typically produced in a studio and then put in place in a finished building. So this again was part of that kind of Gothic sentiment and arts and crafts ideal that Goodhue and Lawrie were working towards. Lawrie was really Goodhue's right-hand man. In the correspondence, he writes now to Winslow, actually, because Goodhue had passed away, but about ideas for the sculpture. I'm sure that this is the model for Herodotus. This is a bust of Herodotus that still is in the Metropolitan Museum in New York, where Lowrie's studio was. And of course, there's still the Gothic ideal that we see in the way the sculpture really emerges from the architecture, especially this sort of classic mid-Gothic French architecture. This is one of the kings and the kings and queen portal that is a Chartres cathedral. You can see the elongation of the figures, which appear almost as if they're classical columns that rise from the building up to the images of the sculpture itself. So I think we have to consider that Lawrie was very much a kind of collaborator beyond the sculpture with Goodhue. I think they talked a great deal. Goodhue, of course, passed away in 1924. Lawrie went on to a stellar career, and whether you are aware of it or not, you probably know a lot of his work. This is the figure of wisdom at Rockefeller Center, the main entry. He worked here actually with Hartley Burr Alexander, who did all of the inscriptions. So they continued to work together on many different commissions. And it was, I think, Alexander who developed this idea of, the passage of time, the passage of knowledge, culminating very much in Los Angeles at the Public Library, which was really a great revelation in that while, as Goodhue says, it owes something to the Spanish colonial, Lawrie recognizes its Gothic roots as well, but it had a tremendous impact on the architecture in Los Angeles. The Spanish colonial revival did not disappear, but it's interesting to note that Albert C. Martin Sr., the firm still exists, who had designed St. Vincent de Paul, which we saw earlier, a very Baroque Spanish revival building, was one of a consortium of architects, John Parkinson and John Austin, who worked on the City Hall. Still a little bit more historicizing than maybe what Goodhue intended, but having been designed even as this building was being completed, the kinship certainly cannot be denied. And I like to think, and I'll end with this, it shows the City Hall, not the Public Library, but on New Year's Day in 1928. This appeared in the Los Angeles Times, and you can see Miss Los Angeles, a Spanish señorita from the sort of past mythology of Los Angeles, which had evolved its whole sort of self-image on being a late sort of Spanish village, in spite of what they did to the Spanish citizens or Hispanic citizens in the city. But of course, this was very much a part of the whole tourist appeal of Los Angeles. If you think of Olvera Street or all of the Spanish colonial revival buildings, this seems to me to fit perfectly with, in a way, what Goodhue and Lawrie were striving for. Here you have Los Angeles, both looking backward to its origin, but looking forward, as the headline on New Year's Day indicates, to a brilliant future with dirigibles and now a modern architecture that, in a sense, completes that kind of voyage from east to west. And so I think the library comes at just this pivotal point, and it may not have been the entire inspiration, but here we have Los Angeles. If you look at population, if you look at industry, if you look at the automobile, Los Angeles citizens had, I forget, 10 times more automobiles per capita than maybe 30 than Chicago, that Los Angeles was now becoming the metropolis of the future and no longer was dependent upon that Spanish kind of heritage. So, thank you.
That was really interesting. I don't think we have time for questions, for formal questions here and the taper, but let's convene over to have our lunch, and you can corner Professor Breisch and raise your questions with him in person. Thank you so much. It was really interesting. Got it?
Yeah, I've got it. I think I've got everything.
Okay, let's go eat.